Hello, everybody. Joining us from the 3D printing session that was fairly well attended, and I think we ran a little long there. So, everybody that's joining in, I appreciate your expeditiousness in joining us in this new session for incident response. This is an area that is obviously top of mind for anyone who's been through a breach or anybody who's bored, questions them about what happens if we get breached, especially the large global environments may operate in multiple different countries, be responsible for different compliance needs in those countries. And so we're really pleased to have Matt Hartley join us here from BreachRx to talk about that space and the kinds of things you need to be thinking about when dealing with incident response. And also, we want to thank our sponsor of this session, and they will be speaking here at the end. Colortokens will spend a little bit 5 minutes there at the end. So with that, I will let Matt take it away. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Randall. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, hey everyone, glad to be here today. Today we're going to talk about incident response, and in particular, as Randall noted, in the framework of how regulations and the regulatory environment are affecting incident response and where incident response is going. So please throw some questions out. It's much more fun if you do that. I'm going to actually try to watch the chat at the same time and react to questions as they come in. So just to get started, it's almost a meme at this point to ask this question. Has anyone not had their data or their data stolen? What you see here on the right is just a bunch of different breaches and the size of the breach. We have breaches now that have exceeded 1 billion records. A record being obviously the information about an individual. You guys see these things in the news every day. I don't probably need to go further than that. There's a lot of pretty sad things when we look at data breaches and their impact on companies around the world. A couple of highlights, though, maybe things that maybe aren't as obvious to you on a day-to-day basis. One is there were over 10,000 breaches reported last year, and a big growth area for breaches for the bad guys is the extortion of from the theft of data. So that went from basically 0 to 10% of breaches in a year and continues to climb. And so as you think about ransomware, and that's obviously been a big deal the last few years, bad guys are basically shifting to just stealing your data and extorting you for it, as much as they are continuing to do ransomware, as you see here. Another fact, a lot of folks think, oh, I'm a medium-sized business, or maybe I'm a small enterprise. I'm not actually going to be targeted. Well, that's significantly changed in the past few years as well. Huge number of enterprise, smaller end enterprises are getting targeted by adversaries. And sadly, in many cases, companies are finding out about these breaches from outside the company after a threat actor has been in their environment for quite a while. The last thing maybe I'll highlight here is the cost of a data breach. There's a great report that Ponemon puts out every year that's called the Cost of a Data Breach Report. And you can see some of the numbers here in the upper right. One of the key things is the data breach is headed toward the cost of $10 million per breach here in the United States. A lot of people don't understand, though, the size of that breach. So people are like, oh, that must just be like one of those mega breaches like the Ticketmaster one or the Equifax one, or pick the latest poison, where there's tens of millions of records impacted. That's not. $10 million is the average cost for a breach, with as little as 2,100 of those, individuals' records impacted, stolen by an adversary. So this is a huge cost, and it's getting worse. It's going up, and so I think as a community, we have to think about, are we really truly prepared for them? I think we can establish that incidents happen, and so let's talk through what incident response looks like right now. Right now, our teams, our security teams, we basically rely on the technology that we purchased and our expertise. We rely on that incident response plan. Some people have gone a little farther. Maybe they flow charted out some steps to take, from their plan, from their policy. A lot of companies are doing, great job with that annual tabletop exercise, making sure that people are in the room and talking through what might happen. We hopefully have some experts on retainer, maybe a law firm, maybe a breach incident response forensics firm. We've all been trained not to write anything down, to always include our lawyer, and to never say the word breach. And so that's great. And we have cyber insurance policy, hopefully, maybe even more than one in some cases. So is that really working for us? Are these just really effective when we think about those stats? The breaches just keep happening. Let's take another step and think about the cybersecurity technology we have in the context here of incident response. And there's a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to read all this to you. I think key thing here is there's 5,000 cybersecurity companies now. And when you look at this graphic on the right, it's not my graphic. It's a graphic from a blog that's using Sunil Yu's Cyber Defense Matrix. One of the things that you kind of observe here is that there's not a whole lot of technologies, a lot of companies focused on respond and recover piece. So we have all this technology, we've done all this training, but when it comes to our response and our recovery processes, as you saw with what we had on the last slide, there's really not a lot there. Obviously, there's investments there and there's new technologies coming in, but at the moment, there isn't a whole lot of technology there. And so when we think about like, are we being effective? Is our technology being effective? I would say governments, they don't seem to think so. And how can we see that? Well, unfortunately, it's the past 5-6 years, we've seen this enormous wave of regulations. And these are data regulations, data breach regulations, cybersecurity regulations. These could be state level and Canada, provincial level. Obviously, there's countries all around the world that have these. There's over 200 regulations all around the world now, and there's a whole bunch on the way. And it's getting to the point where we're seeing, a regulation a week pop up from different places around the world, or we're seeing regulations that are already in place being updated, penalties being added, or new elements to the regulation being added. And so one of the key changes that's happened here in the last couple of years is personal liability is being imposed. What is personal liability? Well, if you work in a company and your company gets sued, that's your company getting sued. You might work there, you might end up in court having to do a deposition or something, but that's the company getting sued. Well, some of these regulations are now saying that you're personally responsible for your company's cybersecurity readiness. And so if the government decides to come after you or your company for your response, they could come after you. That's you personally, as in not as related to your job. So that's your personal assets, that's your house, your families, everything. And so that's kind of scary. I mean, it's actually really scary. It's in a lot of ways, I would say it's unfair. And it's not just here in the US. There's countries all around the world that are beginning to do this and implement this. But the biggest one over the past year that you probably have read about is the SEC cybersecurity guidance for public companies that has come in. That has really shaken things up with this area of regulatory scrutiny that's come into place. Last, I would say a lot of people kind of dismiss regulations. You'll hear people say like, yeah, there's GDPR, but they don't fine anyone. Like it's not that big a deal. Well, that's changing too, unfortunately. Just last year, GDPR by itself, they had over $2 billion in fines. And they're not the only ones obviously doing fines. There's 137 countries with these regulations. And sadly, in some places, the regulatory body that's enforcing these regulations is funded by fines. So if you kind of take a step back and think about that for a second, that means they got a lot of incentive to get fines so they can grow their agency and do more fines. So obviously a lot of pain that we're looking at here as a security professional, as a security leader, when we think about incident response, when we think about what we need to do. And are these regulations really helping? I would say yes. I'm not going to read all this to you. I mean, if we think about like 3 of them, we think about GDPR, that obviously has really affected how we think about protecting data. I just mentioned the SEC rules. That really has affected how we think about an incident and how it affects our business, the materiality of that incident on our business. And it's really, it's kind of the latest in disclosing that we're having incidents in companies. So it's really changed a lot of the way, and we'll talk more about this, we think about how we deal with incidents. And finally, some that are here and or coming over the horizon. Here in the US, we have a law called CCPA, and in Europe, we have a law called NIS2. And These are basically sector-specific laws. CCPA here in the US is basically on the what we call the critical infrastructure, and how this is defined by CISA, by DHS, is there's 16 sectors of the industry here in the United States. That's a lot. Like that's a lot of companies in a lot of different sectors. That's like healthcare, that's telecommunications, that's obviously manufacturing and transportation and a bunch of things you might think of as critical infrastructure, but it includes financial services as well. And so we're seeing governments just kind of continue to pile on here, in part because the frustration that we as citizens all have around just like the breach a day in the news. And so we think about that, and yeah, they're working, but here's what we still hear. And so here at BreacherX, we've talked to over 100 law firms that specialize in cybersecurity and incident response, and that's their fastest growing practice in almost all of them. And these are actual quotes from partners at these firms. In some cases, people have said the same thing essentially more than once. No company is actually prepared regardless of their size. And I've never once used a company's incident response plan, which was shocking to me. I've been in security 25 years. And you kind of take a step back and think about that. And that's really painful. And that's part of the reason I would say why a lot of these firms are growing as fast as they are. Why is this? Why is this a problem? We take a higher level view of incident response. This is kind of what it looks like. It's chaotic nightmare. We have an incident, the incident comes in, security team is typically on the leading edge of that. I'd say the security team is a lot of times better prepared than the rest of the business. But maybe it's an event, as that event grows, becomes something that's more meaningful. Maybe we say, yeah, this is actually an incident, something's happened here. We let legal know, we maybe reach out to the IT team. We're now starting to work across the business. As the maybe scale of this particular event kind of reaches that place where maybe it's even a data breach, we've obviously start to pull in the rest of the business. We've got our business leaders, we've got our leadership team, we're going to get comms involved. This is how it's been for a long time. And every single one of these lines, and obviously there's a lot more in kind of a real incident, every single one of these lines is an interaction. It's a chance for us to have a success, but a lot of times it's also a chance for us to make a mistake, especially because teams don't speak the same language. So when we think about security and legal, for example, legal and security, we don't speak the same language. Like my co-founder is a lawyer. I'm a security guy. And so the two of us, like by default, we don't speak the same language. And so it's really easy for a question to get asked and an answer to get given that is incorrect. And that can cause a big problem. The other thing I would say about this is that a lot of times the rest of the business is not as automated. You think about your leadership team, you think about interacting with your board. A lot of times security teams are pushing stuff into PowerPoints, sending stuff via email. And our legal team is doing a manual review of regulations. Like literally they're pulling up the laws and trying to kind of chew through them, read them, make sure they understand the requirements. You've got all these contracts that require breach notification that they're reviewing as well. We're starting to pull in outside parties to help us here, and they're expensive. $1,500 to $2,000 an hour for outside counsel, for example, to help you out here. Or $500 an hour, maybe for someone right out of school, out of law school. So expensive, a lot of chaos. And unfortunately, given that regulatory picture we just showed, all this stuff here on the right has now come into play and has made it, frankly, a lot worse. It started off with those regulations, those regulators. They're looking for you to tell them you had an incident in 72 hours or sometimes less. The shortest that we've seen is now 1 hour in China. India's got a 6-hour requirement. A lot of 24-hour requirements. CCPA, the law I just mentioned, has a 24-hour requirement for ransomware, for example. So a lot of pain, a lot of pressure that's already getting added to this pressure cooker situation. Because of that, our customers and our partners are demanding even a faster notification. So they want to know because they have their regulators they have to tell. They have their customers that they have to tell. So you have to tell them faster. And so we typically see 24 hours or 48 hours as a notification requirement for those folks. And now our cyber insurance, vendors have gotten into the game here. Obviously, the insurers are there to help us out, and we can transfer risk to them. But in exchange, they want to know about your incident as soon as possible. Typically, we see 24-hour requirement if you want to be able to make a claim in the future. But we actually have recently seen a couple 12 hours. So that means basically you want to be able to get money from your insurer for your incident, you better tell them in 12 hours you had an incident. So imagine like you're trying to just remediate this incident, like something's happened, you want to contain this threat, you want to eradicate them from your environment, and you're having to scramble to get the rest of the team informed across the business so that these folks on the right can also be informed, and do all of that in almost like a perfect way, bridging all these language gaps so that you don't miss something and end up telling a regulator the wrong thing, which is actually going to happen. So let's take a quick step back here and think about everything that we've talked about. Here's another view of this legacy best practice that we have. A lot of times the business teams really think that this is technology's problem to fix, when we know that our security teams are a lot of times overwhelmed. And really we're relying on what I would call the heroic talent of our cybersecurity teams. We're relying on the folks that we've hired and trained, that they have in their skill set the expertise necessary to get in here and deal with this incident, and do that in that kind of crazy pressure cooker situation that I just outlined. We have this incident response plan, but if we really are honest with ourselves, it's really more about checking that box that we have it. It's outdated. They look the same. They're not operational. They're more strategic, kind of high level, maybe has the contacts that you want to get in there. That's great. And a lot of times they're based on a template. Template's been tailored, has your company name, maybe has some company specific stuff in it. But when it comes to actually doing stuff, incident response plan, not your best friend. We do those tabletops. Tabletops are great. Unfortunately, the tabletops have devolved a little bit in a lot of cases to be more thought exercises. And a lot of times we don't have the right people in the room. So we end up kind of hand waving off. Oh yeah, this is when we call legal. And they'd say, oh, great job. Like we're good to go. Instead of actually getting legal in the room or getting comms in the room and making sure that they're ready and really having thoughtful exercises with the types of incidents that our business would face. It's great that we have the ability to pull outside folks in on retainer, forensic firms, law firms, and others, of course. Unfortunately, when you're kind of breaking glass, a lot of times these companies that haven't been in your environment before, they have no context. And so, they're jumping in. I mean, honestly, they're kind of parachuting in to hopefully, you're hoping and relying on them to help you out. They're hoping they can help you out. But a lot of times there's spin up time for them to really understand what's going on. And that's time that's expensive when you think about the fact that you got an adversary who's been in your environment for who knows how long. We've got our teams that are separated, siloed. If you look at that or think about that picture we just talked through, where's the single place where everyone is? The answer is Google Docs and Slack or Teams. A lot of chat, a lot of Zoom. But if our environments are compromised, does that make sense for us to be using those environments? And when we think about legal privilege and the challenges with that, having those things in having our response workspace be a business system is a pretty significant risk now. And finally, you can read about this quite a bit online. Insurers are basically doing everything they can to squeeze down the amount that they're making claims. And I think one of the more egregious things that we've seen not too long ago was customer had insurance policy, was feeling real good about it. We took a look at it for them, and at the kind of buried in the fine print was an exclusion for cryptocurrency payments. Well, if you think about ransomware, that's how bad guys get paid. And so essentially the insurer had created this policy in a way that they wouldn't have to cover ransomware, even though it ostensibly did cover ransomware. And so this is kind of where we're at. And I've been in security, I mentioned, a long time. This feels a lot like 1990s. Like this is a lot of how come we haven't solved this problem yet, when we think about how well we've solved problems in so many other parts of incident response. And why haven't we solved it? In part because it's a business problem. But we're still treating it like it's that security problem, like it's that technical problem. And fascinating stat that you can pull out of the data breach report from the last few years. Only about 30% of the cost of an incident is cybersecurity's. The rest of the business ends up paying, it ends up costing the business about 70% of the cost of an incident. And what we call the long tail of an incident lasts for years afterward in some cases. We've had customers say, they had a small incident where it cost them 50 grand, but it was like the worst sum of their life. And it's just that's the time frame to pull people in and get kind of get this recovery done. And as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing CISOs in particular being held accountable. But in a lot of cases, they really lose control when an incident occurs. The legal team will step in, the business leaders will step in, and a lot of them don't know what to do. Maybe they're asking the CISO for help, maybe they're relying on their gut, and they haven't been maybe included, or maybe they haven't joined the exercises they've been invited to. And we as security leaders are on the hook for making sure that this stuff happens right. Because if it doesn't, then we're on the hook for potentially felony prosecutions, civil lawsuits. You can see that in Joe Sullivan's case. You can see that in Tim Brown's case. And there's a number of others where their companies have just settled outside of court so that we don't have CISOs getting prosecuted in those cases. And at the mean, kind of see some interesting stats here. Like our board believes that we're pretty high risk, but they don't really regularly interact with the CISOs in a way that's meaningful. So there's a lot of challenges here when we think about incident response and what we need to do. How can we solve this? So now that we've gone through kind of the Debbie Downer portion here of the slides, let's talk about what we do now to change the game here for incident response. Well, as a company, we need to prove three things. One, do you have a sound incident response process? Two, are you consistently following that process? And three, did you take the right actions at the right time? You have to be able to prove these things to someone like a regulator, to law enforcement, if they show up, if you have an incident. And that means a lot of things need to change from the legacy approach that we've taken in the past. So what must we get right for modern incident response? First thing we have to do is prepare. And we have to do it meaningfully. So we have to think about it less like a technology problem. We have to think of it less like a check-the-box compliance problem. And we have to think about it as an operational mission problem. The first thing I would say that you need to focus on is the different types of incidents you're likely to face, depending on what industry you're in, depending on what you may have in your business seen in the past. You need to build plans for each of those types of incidents. You need actual procedures that you need to be able to execute, and you need to think through those procedures, and you need to practice those procedures. You need to proactively prepare for all the different obligations that you have for your business. And we like to use the word obligations of breach or X because you have a lot of them. It's not just the obligation you have to your own company in terms of like how you execute your response, but it's all these regulatory requirements. It's every contract that you've signed with a customer or a partner where you've agreed to tell them that you've had an incident. It's law enforcement contact information. How many of you all have the phone number for the FBI field office you would call if you had a massive data breach? How many of you have that on tap in your phone, in your procedures? Probably not a lot. I mean, typically very few folks do. And that's the kind of stuff, if we really open up our mind here and think about this as a business problem, those are the types of things that we need to be proactively preparing for, making sure we're able to answer. And really key here is building that muscle memory. Like actually practice. Some of the best teams that we've seen are practicing like on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. I can't say for your organization what the pace is, but if you're doing annual right now, just aim for biannual. Just do one more a year and actually get some of these folks in the room. Get your legal team in the room. Get your get your comms team in the room. You'd be surprised. They would, in a lot of cases when we do exercises with our customers, those teams love being in the room because they haven't taken the time to get in there. They haven't been drug in there. They haven't been invited in there. And it is eye-opening for them to realize the kinds of decisions that the business will need to make when an incident happens. And I said this before, don't just check the box for compliance. Like we have all these things, ISO 27001, we have SOC 2, we have 853, we've got NIST CSF, a lot of folks aligned to that. And we have outside auditors and we're doing this for ourselves. Those frameworks are good. Those frameworks actually, if you look at them closely, they have quite a bit of depth around incident response generally spread throughout them. I would say most of those frameworks are not well organized in my opinion, but they do have quite a bit to help you understand what you need to do for incident response. And by the way, if you're not sure where to start, go pull up CIS controls. It's amazing. Like it's well organized, it's clean, it's easy to understand. It's a great place to start if you haven't. But regardless, like you're doing this for meaningful preparation. So just kind of dig in, and really understand what to expect when an incident occurs. And part of that is bridging those language gaps I mentioned. So as you practice and as you deal with incidents, you got to get everybody on the same page. You have to help people understand, being able to work from the same place, being able to understand that when when legal asks a question like, hey, what's the data security here for this data? Or like, how secure was this data? They might be asking like, was the data encrypted? So you might need to ask questions back. You might say like, well, the data was hashed. And then they might not know what hashed means. Or you might say, someone might say like, oh yeah, the data is protected, like it's encrypted. We use SHA-256 hashes, and that actually might not be a high enough bar for a regulation to, like, you might still have to notify a regulator if you're hashing stuff, even though it's sort of encryption, just given the way these laws are defined. And so that's a key example of a language gap here between teams that is really challenging to overcome. And one of the best ways to overcome that is to work together with those procedures in kind of that same place, like I mentioned before. And part of that too is don't just default to what you know. It's so critical. Like we hear this consistently. We use the word consistency now because so many of the people that we've talked to, of our customers, have told us consistency is key to them. We as security professionals want to default to what we know. We want to jump in and save the day and solve problems. And it's great. Like we are solving problems every day in a lot of cases as we're understaffed to do that. But in this case, we can't miss steps, and it requires us to have those procedures. I mean, it's almost like if you think about how a military pilot gets ready for a mission. They've got a checklist of things that they do when they get in that plane. They do it every time. They do it when they practice. They do it when they do simulator flights. They do it so much that they know it, but they still look at the list. Why? Because they don't want to miss a critical step. That's the same level of importance we need to treat incident response here. We need to understand the procedures that we need to take, and we need to follow them, and we need to just make sure that we're not missing anything. We need to make sure that the other teams we're working with aren't missing anything either. A key point in really any process here is making sure also we don't have the one guy who knows everything and no one else does, or the one guy can't go on vacation, because if you have an incident and he's on vacation, you're in deep trouble. And so it's really critical. Hopefully you don't have that. It's really critical that you find ways to solve for that. Again, incident response practice is key there. Like, get that knowledge out to others. Well, what would happen if we're in the middle of an incident and Slack goes down? How are we going to communicate? Someone might have some answers about that, but maybe not everybody knows it. You need to have folks know how to deal with that during an incident. That's just a simple example. So ultimately that, again, having the processes fleshed out so that we know what to do, so we don't have and rely on kind of what we know and this tribal knowledge from our business, is so critical to an efficient response, an effective response. And finally, centralize your decision making and centralize your communications. Like we see it approached in different ways with different companies. We have some companies that have a single incident lead that's assigned, and that person owns the incident. Even if there's an escalation to the CISO or someone else, that person is the owner of the incident. Obviously working really closely with the CISO if they get looped in, and the CISO is obviously working with the leadership to centralize that decision making. Same with communications. You can't have every random person trying to communicate externally on Twitter or to some media person that might just call random phone numbers to see what they can find out, or a bad guy for that same exact example. Have a bad guy calling in to different folks to try to elicit what's going on in terms of the response. So having that central decision making is really critical. In a lot of cases with the folks that we've worked with at the beginning of an incident, or an exercise, there's a little bit of chaos. There's a little bit of like, no one's really stepping up to take charge. But once someone does, things tend to get a lot more smooth, and they tend to execute a lot more efficiently. And so you need to know who that person's going to be during an incident. And hopefully it isn't your CISO, because your CISO, just as much as everybody else, wants to be able to go on vacation too. And so hopefully the CISO, maybe the CISO is, if the CISO's around, but the CISO needs a second person. The CISO can't be a single point of failure either. And so all of this is really critical to having an efficient response and making sure that we're able to contain this not just adversary, but contain this incident so you don't end up with 2 years of court cases and regulators looking under the hood to see what's going on. Oh. So the last piece here I'll say is let's look beyond security and find ways to reduce the cost of an incident and reduce the risk of an incident. And the first is legal privilege. And I didn't touch on this earlier, but now's a good time to do that. Legal privilege has really changed. If we look back 10 years, the answer was, oh, just put your lawyer in the room. Then it was, or put your lawyer on the email. Then it was like, well, put the banner in the email or put the banner on the, your team's room. That doesn't work anymore. Unfortunately, in the past few years, there's been a bunch of court cases that have ruled that if you're using a business system for incident response, then that incident response must just be a routine business process. And therefore, you're not really able to argue for privilege on that. And so that Teams channel, Slack channel, sure, that can roll into court if you get sued. And by the way, and we can see this in the SolarWinds case, since you're using Teams, maybe people are talking about this outside that channel too. And so we want the whole team server for court. And that's happened in multiple cases at this point. So imagine, just take a quick pause and think about your Slack server, your team server, and all the different channels and all the different chatter that's in there. Someone's having a bad day. Someone's probably said something terrible like, we're not a security first company because we didn't do X the right way. And imagine that being in court now. And that's happened. And so we have to change the way that we think about legal privilege. And the first thing that we have to do is we have to recognize that we have to write stuff down. We have to prove that we have that process that I talked about already. And we have to prove that we know what we're doing, that we've executed effectively, that we made decisions, we didn't just wing it. We also have to be able to protect the conversations that we need to have. And to do that, it isn't about just tossing your legal person in the room with you or putting a banner in. That's not going to work. It's about creating a system of record and having those communications in a platform that's purpose-built for incident response. And maximizing the separation of the record that you're creating from the conversations that everybody knows you need to have. You're allowed to have privileged conversations. You just have to understand how this dynamic changes. That's a big one, honestly. Like a lot of folks haven't caught up to that yet. And I would say go back and have a conversation with your legal person about privilege and challenge them a little bit on that. When you're talking to them, mention to them they should adopt some technology. I would say, our legal friends have, they're a little stuck in the past in some ways. We see many legal teams tend to be, a lot more people driven than a lot of the different areas of the business that have been technology enabled at this point, or technology streamlined even. And so I think a key thing that you can do to help your business have a more efficient response is to get the legal team to adopt some technology. Instead of them trying to pull the law by Googling or by going to a state law website and like trying to search around and find the law and read the law, like help adopt some technology to like look the law up and give them the summary of the law. Like it's pretty straightforward stuff. And that's pretty key to help you move fast in an incident. Third here, communications are crucial. And this is communications internally. This is communications within your business. So internally in your security team, your response team, within your business. We've had some interesting findings. Like we were in an exercise once where someone kind of raised their hand. We were kind of toward the end of the exercise and it wasn't going well. And the person's like, hey, I'm an employee stock owner here. Like, do I need to be worried that my stock is like going to zero right now? And it really opened the eyes to a lot of the folks in the room of like, wow, we got to make sure we're on top of employee comms. And so think about your employees. And then obviously external communications. And we could do a whole presentation just on that. But I'd say, just like everything else, communications can't be crisis. Communications need to be prepared. And the people that are working on your communications, whether that's your team or people that you bring in from the outside, they need to understand all the stuff you've said before, all the stuff you've promised, all the stuff on your website. Because if you put out communications that contradict something that you've promised or said before, you're just adding to your pain here when you have an incident. And so that's a really key area. And honestly, a great place to start is get your comms folks in a room when you do an exercise. Have that. I mean, the exercise doesn't go well. Okay, comms guy, like we need to like let our customers know what are we going to do. Do they have a template? Have they ever written one before? If not, like that's a pretty critical thing that they should go work on so that the next time around you guys practice, they can show up and show that they're going to have great comms. Finally, help your executives be prepared for key decisions. Help them understand that they might have to make a call to pay a ransom or not. They might need to make a call to ignore the law and pay a ransom to a potential country that's on the OFAC list. And that puts them in personal liability land. But these are the kinds of things that in their role, they're already doing, they're already making those key decisions. They're not exposed to the key decisions here that they might need to make when a bad incident happens. And so you should help them understand that. And it doesn't have to be that dire, right? Help them understand, like, well, when would we tell our customers, given different scenarios, or how would we communicate with customers, or how would we communicate internally? Who does have the ball? Who gets to make the call about notifying customers or whatever during that incident? So these are things that you can do to help reduce the risk of your incidents, but also reduce the cost. If you can streamline your response, then as you work with those outside providers we talked about, everything is more efficient. You're not going to your outside counsel and saying, hey, put all this together from scratch to me. Or you're not going to your comms firm and saying, hey, put all this together from scratch for me. You're saying, hey, comms firm, here's my template for this type of incident for comms to customers. Like, how's this look? Hey, outside counsel, like, here's our regulatory analysis. We think it's these 6 states. Like, hey, you got 30 minutes of time. Go knock this out real fast. Constrain our cost. So those are some simple things that we can do to go beyond security to also help here with incidents. Love this quote. We've stolen this. It's actually on our website now from a CISO of a big company. Incident response records are now audited like financial records. Just like think about that for a second. Our financial records get a lot of scrutiny. We pay big 4 companies big money to come in and audit our financial records, or we pay, for a smaller company, maybe we don't pay a big 4 company, but we pay someone to look at our books. That's where we're at now with incident response records. So this is another conversation that you should have internally. If someone says don't write anything down, you're going to be in deep trouble when a regulator comes in and you have nothing to show them that you did. It's going to look to them like you winged it. And it can't just be the big data breach scenario that you're showing that you have that process that we talked about earlier. You need to have some level of records for your incidents, for how you respond to incidents. Remember what I said earlier, those 3 things that we need to do. We need to have a process, and we need to show that we're following that process, and we need to be able to show outsiders that we're following that process. And so having records of these meaningful incidents, you get to decide what meaningful is for your business. One easy bar might be any incident that goes beyond security. So if you have to call legal because of this incident, that's one you probably want to have some records around. This is a way that you need to be thinking about incident response now, because when the regulator shows up, you need to be ready to play the tape back and really understand what has happened previously, and be able to show them that you've got a process, that you've followed that process, and you do that consistently every time. So with that, I will pause for any questions or anything anybody might want to talk about. Well, don't be shy. All right, well, thanks everyone. Hope this was informative. You have my contact info if you want to learn more.
Matt, really appreciate it, sir. And I want to thank our sponsor for the session. Oh, wait, we do have one question. Oh no, Spencer was just saying, good job. So yeah, we've got here we go. A question from Robert. When engaging in an IR, how do you best get log data into a data lake?
Yeah, great question. So obviously there's a lot of variation depending on the types of tools that you're using. But one of the things I always talk to teams about is the sprawl of data that we have. And so if you have a single data lake, that's great. I am all about automation. So whether that's an integration with the SOAR platform or technology integration directly with your lake, depending on the tech you're using, just think about the retention and the cost of that, and try not to have the data sprawl to a whole bunch of places. I would also think about the number of times you've had to pull data from the lake in the past, and think about that retention period. So you aren't just saving data for the sake of saving data. That'd be my answer. I don't know, Blaine, if you have anything to add to that.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We want to thank Colortokens for sponsoring this session and give them a few minutes to speak if so desired.
All right. Well, thank you, Randall. Very informative there, Matt. Really appreciate that. My name is Blaine. I'm the Director of SCs for the Americas here in the U.S., based in Dallas. I've been in security going on 25 or so years. The last 7.5 has been specialized in microsegmentation. Yes, Colortokens is a microsegmentation company. Usually at this point, I start to ask the audience, who's familiar with microsegmentation? And a lot of people always raise their hand, but I stopped doing that because I've discovered that there is just a ton of misinformation out there about what microsegmentation really is. We're used to talking to people like Cisco and Palo Alto, and they have their own definitions, but I find it easier just to go ahead and state based on what even the industry analysts claim as the definition of segmentation. And that is, we tend to think of things in terms of like zones or VLANs, and we create, all these different lines of delineation to separate things in our systems or on our network. But what they're not taking into account is those internal broadcast domains. What's to stop the east-west movement once you're inside that VLAN? And where's your visibility to what's happening? So microsegmentation is where we take that fine point of, the delineation, and we pull it down to the individual server itself. So essentially just consider it wrapping a firewall around every single workload on your environment. Now, one of the first misconceptions here is that that's going to be really difficult, hard to manage, and that is absolutely false. The reason it's not hard to manage, and am I not sharing right now? Let me bring this up real quick. The reason it's not hard to manage is because of one key piece that we have called visualization. Let me know when y'all can see my screen, please. Can you see that?
Yep, we got it.
Okay. It's the visualization. So every good segmentation product out there is going to give you a topology map, a real-time living organic map that's going to constantly update with all new workflows between given endpoints on your network. We're going to take it one step further, where each element on that map is interactive. So with just a couple clicks of a mouse, you can say server A can talk to endpoint B, but only on this point. Or this network, my user network, can communicate with this database server, but only on this port. And it's very quick. Literally with just a couple clicks of a mouse, you can define that policy. And then we take it even yet another step further by giving you the ability to simulate what that policy is going to do before you push it out to your servers. So you can see in almost real time what's going to happen, if there's going to create a domino effect throughout your enterprise network, or if it's just going to be perfectly fine. If you're happy with it, at that point, you put it into enforcement mode. Now, the other part of this is the protection phase. If you listen to the industry analysts, they're talking about zero trust a lot. And that's not just a marketing term. I know everybody says it is, but zero trust is a very real thing. The analysts have all come together and agreed that if you want zero trust, there is no way to do it without the foundation, which is microsegmentation. Meaning microsegmentation alone will not get you zero trust, but you will not get to zero trust without it. So whether it's my company or whether it's one of our competitors, just do something. If you're truly interested in getting to zero trust, you got to have some sort of microsegmentation platform. And then finally, the third point is measuring your risk of your environment. A lot of companies in my old company that was a competitor I worked in, they'd buy this product and they really had no way to measure their progress, no way to report back to management how far they had gotten, and it ultimately became shelfware. We give you the ability through constant analysis of your servers and your endpoints. We can measure exactly how much risk is associated on the given endpoint level and as well as your statewide level. So you now have actionable information that you can export or print out to give to your executives and say, look, we spent this money. Here's where we are in our microsegmentation journey. And here's where our risk profile started. And now here's where it is that we're halfway through. So all of that is made possible by our very simple architecture. And the architecture is twofold. We have both an agent-based architecture and we have an agentless architecture. Starting with our core, which is our agent base, it's very simple. There's an agent that runs in user space on your endpoints. They could be servers in a data center, they could be in the cloud, they could be a user's home, it doesn't matter. The only requirement for this agent is that you have access to the operating system, no matter where it sits. On that endpoint or on that workload, we're going to be collecting all the information about your inbound and outbound flow tables. We're going to be looking at system resource utilization. We're going to collect all that information and send it back up to the cloud platform where we're going to create that map, that live interactive map I was talking about. That's where you'll build your policies, you'll simulate the policies, and when you're happy with the way it looks, you send that back down to your servers, and the agents on that server will hand that policy over to your local operating system firewall. So in the case of Windows, we're talking WFP. In the case of Linux, we're talking NF tables or IP tables. This gives us some very distinct advantages to make this really simple. Number one, as your network sits today, 0 modifications to deploy color tokens. 0. You don't have to modify a VLAN. You don't have to change an IP. None of that. Again, it doesn't matter where it sits. It could be in a closet in your garage at home. As long as you can access that OS, you can install and run color tokens. Number two, we are not the enforcement point. So even if you were to have a major internet outage of some sort and you couldn't communicate with our SaaS platform, your servers are going to continue running with their last known policy because it's your OS firewall that's purpose built for that platform to give you the most performance out of it. Once the services are restored to the cloud, we simply sync up policies and you start, managing as normal. And finally, you're using what you already own. So that takes us into the next biggest myth about segmentation is it's not expensive. 99% of the time, it's cheaper than the hardware-based platforms that you're going to deploy. Your OpEx, your CapEx across the spectrum are all going to be lower. So with all that, we have one other area that we have to cover, which is our OT environment. And this is where our agentless solution comes into play. We all know that there's devices out there, especially here in Texas with oil and gas, that has a lot of embedded systems where there's no facility to run firewalls or anything like that. We needed a solution for that. So what we've done is we've developed what's called a gatekeeper. This can either be a virtual appliance where we give you the ISO, or it can be a hardware appliance that we can sell you. Our smallest device will handle up to 250 devices. Our largest will handle up to tens of thousands with a 10 gig, or actually now we have a 100 gig backplane. All this does is it sits in your network on 2 legs, the blue into your core network and the orange out to your OT network or your IoT network, and we hand out /32s to every device. That makes every device in a network on its own, which means they cannot see each other. They can't talk to each other. They can't do anything that we don't allow them to do. We now do the policy enforcement right here on this device, the gatekeeper itself, and we say what these devices can do. I run this here at home in my home lab for my guest wireless. Anybody that gets on my home wireless, they get automatically put into a policy set that says all they can do is go out to the internet on port 80 and 443. They can't talk to each other and they can't see anything on my core network. It's seamless. It's 100% integrated into our platform. So when you're looking at this from a management perspective, you don't know the difference between agent-based or agentless. You do all the policy definition and enforcement the exact same way. So that's basically it. Again, I want to thank Fulcrum for letting us come in here and talk about the product. I know I went through that really, really fast, but time is of essence, and I want to give you all a little bit of time to go grab some coffee. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Blaine. Appreciate your sponsorship.
Thank you.
All right. Well, it's we're going to wrap up the IR session, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Cheers.